Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it, even though nothing obviously bad was said? No insult, no raised voice, no confrontation, just a smile, a few innocent questions, and a strange heaviness you couldn't explain? Most people think jealousy is loud. They imagine slammed doors, cold shoulders, eye rolls, and obvious resentment. But the most dangerous jealous people don't announce themselves that way. They lean in. They smile warmly. They ask questions that sound supportive, thoughtful, even caring. And yet, somehow after talking to them, your excitement fades, your confidence shrinks, and your joy feels exposed, as if someone reached into your chest without permission and quietly rearranged things. This is the kind of jealousy nobody warns you about. There was a man named Daniel who learned this the slow way. Daniel wasn't extraordinary by public standards. He didn't come from money. He didn't have a viral story. He wasn't loud or charismatic in a way that demanded attention. But he had something rarer, momentum. His life was finally moving forward in a direction that felt right, and for the first time he trusted himself enough to say that out loud. In his early 30s, Daniel worked a job that paid the bills but never stirred his soul. For years he told himself he was being practical, responsible, realistic. Then one quiet winter evening, sitting alone in his small apartment, he admitted a truth he'd been avoiding. He felt invisible in his own life. Not ignored by others, ignored by himself. So he started waking up earlier, reading, learning, writing ideas in a cheap notebook he kept beside his bed. He didn't tell many people, just enough to feel accountable. Eventually, the changes showed. He stood differently, spoke more clearly, laughed more easily. People noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because he no longer shrank when attention came. That's when the questions began. They came from someone he trusted, someone who had been around long before the shift, someone who smiled when Daniel spoke about his goals, nodded thoughtfully, and said things like, "That's exciting." The tone was right. The timing felt right. There was no reason to suspect anything. At first, the questions felt harmless, curious, even flattering. "So, where do you see this going, really?" Daniel answered honestly. He talked about possibilities, not guarantees, about effort, not entitlement. He spoke with the cautious optimism of someone who knew success wasn't promised, but growth was possible. The smile stayed. The nodding continued. But something subtle happened next. "Well," the person said lightly, "don't you think a lot of people try that and fail?" It wasn't said cruelly. There was no smirk. Just a conversational observation, almost protective in tone, as if the question was meant to save Daniel from disappointment. He laughed it off at the time, told himself it was realism, not negativity. Except that night, as he lay in bed, the question replayed. Not loudly, softly, like a whisper he hadn't invited. A few weeks later, Daniel shared a small win, not a life-changing breakthrough, just a moment of progress. He'd finished something he'd been putting off for months. It mattered to him. He mentioned it casually, expecting a simple, nice, or good for you. The smile came again. "Oh, wow," the person said. "And how long did that take you?" Daniel answered. "Huh?" they replied, eyebrows lifting just slightly. "Do you think that's sustainable long term?" There it was again. Not a statement, a question, open-ended, reasonable on the surface. And yet, after hearing it, Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a sense that something fragile had been touched. He started to notice a pattern. Whenever he felt energized, curious questions followed. Whenever he felt proud, the questions arrived like soft rain, gentle but persistent, slowly eroding the ground beneath his confidence. Nothing was ever said outright. No one told him he wasn't capable. No one criticized his character. But somehow, after each conversation, Daniel felt the urge to explain himself, to justify his ambition, to downplay his excitement so he wouldn't seem naive. That's when the doubt crept in. He began editing his words before speaking, shrinking his dreams mid-sentence, adding disclaimers like maybe and probably not and I don't know, we'll see. Not because he believed them, but because it felt safer to preempt the questions. What disturbed him most was how reasonable it all sounded. If the questions had been aggressive, he could have dismissed them. If they'd been insulting, he could have pushed back. But they weren't. They were framed as concern. as curiosity, as intelligence, and that made them dangerous. One evening, after another conversation that left him strangely deflated, Daniel sat alone and tried to pinpoint the feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was smaller than that, quieter. Like someone had turned down the volume on his inner voice and replaced it with static. He realized something uncomfortable. The person asking these questions never shared their own aspirations, never talked about risks they were taking, never revealed dreams that could be questioned in return. They stayed safely in analysis mode, examining Daniel's life from the outside, always asking, never exposing. That imbalance mattered. Psychologists talk about something called covert social undermining, a behavior where people subtly sabotage others through indirect means, questions, tone shifts, backhanded curiosity, while maintaining plausible deniability. Research in social psychology shows that envy often doesn't express itself through hostility, but through what appears to be concern or skepticism, especially when the envious person wants to preserve a positive self-image. Daniel didn't know the term then, he just knew how he felt. He began replaying past conversations with new awareness, the timing of the questions, the repetition, the way they always followed moments of joy, never moments of struggle. No one asked probing questions when he was tired or discouraged, only when he was hopeful. That's when it clicked. These questions weren't meant to understand him. They were meant to regulate him, to pull him back into a version of himself that felt less threatening, less visible, less alive. And the worst part was how easy it had been to accept them. Daniel realized he had been handing over his joy voluntarily, answering questions he didn't owe answers to, justifying dreams that didn't need permission. He had mistaken curiosity for care and politeness for safety. The next time the questions came, something changed. So, the familiar voice said, smiling, "What happens if this doesn't work out the way you expect?" Daniel paused. He felt the old instinct rise, the urge to explain, soften, reassure. Then he noticed something else, the quiet steadiness in his chest when he didn't rush to respond. "I'll handle it," he said simply. The smile flickered, just for a second. No follow-up question came. That moment stayed with him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. The power of the questions had only existed because he kept answering them as if they were tests he had to pass. Over time, he shared less with people who questioned more than they supported, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. He learned that not everyone who listens deserves access. Not every question is an invitation. Some are probes, some are pressure points. And as his life continued to expand, quietly, steadily, he noticed something else. The people who were genuinely happy for him asked different kinds of questions. Questions that built instead of chipped away. Questions that didn't end with doubt, but with possibility. Daniel often wonders, how many people never notice this pattern? How many dreams are downsized not because they're unrealistic, but because they're constantly examined under the wrong light? How many people confuse subtle jealousy for wisdom and slowly talk themselves out of becoming who they were meant to be? So here's the real question. How many times have you answered a question that was never meant to understand you, only to make you doubt yourself? Now let's talk about what those questions actually sound like, and why they work so well. Because once you understand the psychology behind them, something powerful happens. You stop hearing them as curiosity. You hear them as signals. Human beings are wired for social calibration. Neuroscience shows that our brains constantly scan for social feedback to determine what's safe to express and what should be suppressed. When someone responds to our excitement with uncertainty, our brain often interprets it as a warning, even if no danger exists. Studies from the University of California have shown that social doubt activates the same neural pathways as physical threat, especially when it comes from someone within our trusted circle. That's why these questions hit harder than criticism from strangers. Jealousy doesn't always come from hatred. Often, it comes from comparison. From the quiet discomfort of watching someone else step into a version of life you once imagined for yourself but never pursued. And when that discomfort isn't consciously acknowledged, it leaks out sideways, through questions that sound neutral but carry emotional weight. There are patterns to these questions. They repeat across cultures, personalities, and environments. Different words, same intention, they are designed to do 5 things. Redirect attention from your excitement to potential failure. Shift authority from your intuition to their judgment. Create asymmetry where you explain and they observe. Plant uncertainty without taking responsibility for it, and maintain their emotional position without appearing unsupportive. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And the most important thing to understand is this: the danger isn't in the question itself, it's in how reflexively we answer it. We've been taught that openness is virtue, that explaining ourselves is maturity, that defensiveness is weakness. But psychological boundaries aren't built by shutting down, they're built by discernment, by knowing when curiosity is genuine and when it's quietly extractive. As we move forward, you'll start to recognize the 5 questions that appear again and again in moments of growth. You'll hear them differently, not as challenges to overcome, but as signals to pause, to protect something fragile, to keep joy from becoming public property before it's strong enough to stand on its own. And once you learn to spot them, you won't need to argue, convince, or withdraw dramatically. You'll simply stop feeding the trap. Once you recognize that jealousy often hides behind curiosity, the world starts to sound different. Conversations you once replayed in confusion suddenly make sense. The weight you couldn't explain now has a shape. And the questions, those innocent, polished questions, begin to reveal their true function. The first question jealous people almost always ask is disguised as realism. It sounds like grounding, it sounds mature, it sounds responsible. Do you really think this is going to work? On the surface, it feels logical, almost helpful. But notice the timing. This question rarely appears when you're struggling or uncertain. It appears when you're energized, when you've already taken action, when your belief is just strong enough to be felt, but not yet unshakable. Psychologically, this question does something precise. It pulls your attention away from momentum and forces it into hypothetical failure. Research from Stanford on motivation shows that early-stage goals rely heavily on emotional reinforcement. Doubt introduced too early doesn't make plans better, it makes people quit. And jealous people often unconsciously sense that timing perfectly. They don't say, "I hope you fail." They say, "What if it doesn't work?" And suddenly, instead of feeling proud of movement, you're defending the future. The trap here is subtle. You feel pressured to prove you've thought it through, to demonstrate intelligence, to reassure them and yourself that you're not being foolish. So, you explain contingencies, backup plans, worst-case scenarios. You speak the language of caution instead of conviction. What they get is reassurance. What you lose is clarity. People who genuinely support you might ask how they can help or what excites you most. Jealous curiosity asks you to justify hope. The second question sounds like comparison, but it's framed as curiosity. How are you different from everyone else who tried this? This one cuts deeper because it attacks identity, not strategy. Human beings are intensely sensitive to social ranking. Studies in evolutionary psychology show that perceived similarity to failed peers increases fear response and lowers risk tolerance. When someone asks this question, they're not asking about your uniqueness. They're collapsing you into a crowd of imagined failures. Again, notice the framing. It's not, "What makes your approach unique?" It's, "Why won't you end up like the rest?" You're placed on trial next to ghosts of people you've never met. And once again, you respond. You list reasons, skills, circumstances, effort. But something interesting happens in your body while you do this. Your shoulders tense, your voice lowers slightly. You're no longer sharing, you're defending. Jealousy thrives in that posture, because even if your answers are good, the emotional shift has already occurred. Your ambition is no longer expansive, it's boxed into justification, and the person asking gets to remain safely detached, never revealing what they themselves want or fear. The third question is especially dangerous because it pretends to be concern for your well-being. Aren't you worried about what this might cost you? Pause, what? Cost is a powerful word. It activates loss aversion, one of the strongest biases in the human brain. Behavioral economists have shown that people feel losses roughly twice as intensely as gains. When this question is introduced, your brain immediately begins calculating sacrifice, even if none is required yet. Time, energy, relationships, stability, reputation. None of these are bad things to consider, but timing matters. Jealous people bring up cost before value, risk before meaning, sacrifice before reward, not because they're wise, but because your expansion threatens their equilibrium. If you pause and think about it, truly supportive people often say things like, "I know this matters to you," or "You've thought about this a lot," they don't immediately highlight loss. They recognize purpose first. This question slowly reframes your dream as a burden, something heavy, something selfish, maybe even irresponsible. And because you don't want to seem reckless, you begin minimizing your desire. "It's not that big of a deal. I'm just trying it out. We'll see." Each sentence distances you from your own intention. The fourth question is quieter, and because of that, it's often missed. What do other people think about this? This question hands authority away from your inner compass and distributes it to an invisible audience. It invites imagined judgment into a space that was previously personal. Neuroscience research shows that when people imagine being evaluated by others, activity increases in the brain's default mode network, which is associated with rumination and self-consciousness. In simpler terms, you stop feeling and start performing. Jealous people ask this because they're uncomfortable being the only skeptical voice. They want consensus, even fictional consensus. They want you to feel watched. Suddenly, you're no longer pursuing something because it feels right. You're evaluating it through the eyes of parents, friends, coworkers, society, people who aren't in the room but now live rent-free in your head. And the most revealing part? The jealous person rarely tells you what they think directly. They hide behind others. The fifth question is the most manipulative of all because it disguises itself as humility. What if you're wrong? This isn't asked to explore truth, it's asked to erode certainty. Of course you could be wrong. Every meaningful pursuit carries uncertainty. But asking this question in moments of confidence isn't philosophical. It's destabilizing. It positions doubt as wisdom and belief as arrogance. Psychologists have found that people who feel threatened by another's confidence often attempt to equalize the emotional field by introducing uncertainty. If they can't rise, they'll pull. And here's the key insight. These 5 questions are almost never asked in isolation. They come as a pattern, a sequence, over time, always after progress, always wrapped in politeness. Once you recognize the pattern, you realize something liberating. You don't owe answers to every question. This is where the shift happens. Emotionally mature people aren't those who explain everything. They're the ones who know what deserves explanation and what deserves protection. Your joy, especially in its early stages, is fragile. Neurologically, excitement is vulnerable to social influence. That's not weakness, it's biology. Think of it like a flame. You don't carry it through a storm to prove it's real. You shield it until it's strong enough to survive wind. This is where boundaries come in. Not loud ones, not aggressive ones, but quiet internal boundaries. The kind where you recognize a trap and simply choose not to step into it. You might respond with neutrality. That's something I'm still exploring. I'm comfortable with the uncertainty. I don't feel the need to have it all figured out yet. Notice how these responses don't defend, they don't justify, they don't invite debate, they close the loop. There's an interesting social phenomenon that happens when you stop feeding these questions. The person asking often becomes restless, the smile tightens, the curiosity fades, because the function of the question was never information, it was regulation. And when regulation fails, the behavior often stops. At this point in the journey, it's important to pause and reflect on something uncomfortable. Not all jealousy is malicious. Many people asking these questions don't consciously want to harm you. They're responding to their own unresolved comparisons, their own stalled desires, their own fear of movement. That doesn't make the impact any less real, but it changes how you respond. You don't need to confront, you don't need to accuse, you don't need to explain, you just need awareness. In fact, one of the most powerful things you can do is notice how different people respond to your growth. Some lean in, some celebrate quietly, some ask questions that expand possibility, and some ask questions that shrink it. Your nervous system knows the difference before your mind does. That tight feeling in your chest, that sudden urge to downplay, that impulse to justify something that felt pure moments ago, those are signals. And here's something rarely talked about. Protecting your happiness doesn't mean isolating yourself. It means being selective about access. It means understanding that not everyone who listens is listening for your benefit. Halfway through this realization, it's worth saying this gently. If this is resonating, you're not imagining things. And if you've ever felt your excitement fade after harmless conversations, you're not alone. Sometimes simply recognizing that is enough to restore a sense of inner balance. As you become more aware, you'll also start to notice how your own questions land on others. Awareness moves both directions. You'll catch yourself before projecting doubt where encouragement would be more honest. That's growth too. Now, as we move deeper, there's another layer to understand. Why these questions work even when you know better. Why intelligent, self-aware people still feel shaken by them. Why confidence isn't always enough. It comes down to something ancient and human. Belonging. For most of our evolutionary history, standing out was dangerous. Social rejection meant death. Even today, our brains treat subtle social disapproval as a threat. Jealous questions tap into that instinct. They whisper, "If you keep going, you might be alone." And sometimes that fear is enough to make people stop. But here's the paradox. The people who grow into themselves, the ones who build lives that feel authentic, are almost always misunderstood in the middle. Not hated, not attacked, just quietly questioned. If no one has ever tried to shrink your excitement, it might mean you've never stretched far enough to unsettle the familiar. That doesn't mean seek conflict. It means stop interpreting doubt as truth. As you continue forward, you'll find that your responses change, not just outwardly, but inwardly. The questions lose their sting. You don't rehearse answers later. You don't feel the need to explain your life to imaginary juries. And something else happens too. Your joy becomes quieter but stronger, less performative, more rooted. You share wins with fewer people, but the right ones. You speak dreams in spaces where they are met with curiosity that builds instead of corrodes. You learn that enthusiasm doesn't need witnesses to be real. By the time you fully integrate this awareness, you'll notice that jealous questions no longer dominate your memory. They become background noise, recognizable, predictable, manageable. And perhaps the most freeing realization of all is this. The presence of these questions is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's often a sign that you're doing something real. There comes a quiet moment, usually after you've recognized the pattern, after the questions have lost their sharpness, when you realize something even more unsettling than jealousy itself. Some of the most dangerous questions didn't come from others. They came from inside you. That's the part no one talks about. Jealous people don't just ask questions. Over time, if you're not careful, they teach you how to ask them of yourself. The voice changes, but the script stays the same. And by then, the external threat is gone, but the internal one remains. This is where the real work begins, because the final section of this journey isn't about spotting jealous people. It's about undoing the damage subtle doubt leaves behind and rebuilding a relationship with your own excitement, your own intuition, your own inner authority. Neuroscience shows that when people act in alignment with internal motivation rather than external validation, activity increases in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with meaning and long-term satisfaction. In other words, the brain literally rewards you for honoring your inner compass. This is where jealousy loses its leverage. Because jealous questions only work when your happiness is negotiable, when it requires approval, when it depends on being understood. Once your joy becomes private, grounded, and internally validated, questions lose their power to derail you. At this point, it's worth addressing a subtle but important distinction. There is a difference between wise skepticism and jealous doubt. Wise skepticism asks questions to refine direction. It's collaborative. It feels expansive, not constricting. It often comes with shared vulnerability. The person asking is willing to be wrong too. Jealous doubt, on the other hand, asks questions to slow momentum. It never offers alternatives. It never shares risk. It leaves you holding uncertainty alone. Your body knows which is which. One tightens, the other steadies. As you move forward, you'll start to notice something else. Your tolerance for certain conversations changes. You're no longer drawn to endlessly analyzing what could go wrong. You're more interested in what feels alive. This doesn't make you reckless, it makes you selective. And something else shifts too, your compassion. When you recognize jealousy for what it is, you stop personalizing it. You see it as a signal of unresolved desire in someone else, not a verdict on your worth. That doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior, but it does mean you stop absorbing it. You can hold empathy without handing over influence. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing this. Not everyone who questions you is against you, but not everyone who questions you is for you either. Discernment lives in that middle space. As your life continues to grow, because it will in some form, you'll find that the questions change again. They become fewer, sharper, more transparent. People either meet you where you are or drift away naturally. And that's okay. Growth has a way of rearranging relationships without drama. Toward the end of this journey, there's one final realization that ties everything together. The opposite of jealousy isn't praise, it's presence. People who are secure in themselves don't need to regulate others. They don't ask questions to diminish joy because joy doesn't threaten them. They can sit with someone else's excitement without needing to measure it against their own life. And as you become more secure, you become that person too. You stop asking shrinking questions, not just to others, but to yourself. You replace, what if I fail, with what am I learning? You replace, am I different enough, with am I aligned? You replace, what will people think, with what do I think? That shift doesn't make life easy, but it makes it honest, and honesty has a quiet power. It steadies you when doubt circles. It keeps you moving when questions arise. It reminds you that not every feeling needs consensus to be real. So, if you take nothing else from this, take this with you. Pay attention to how people respond to your light. Not what they say, not how polite they sound, but how you feel afterward. Your joy doesn't need interrogation to be valid. Your excitement doesn't need balance to be intelligent. Your path doesn't need witnesses to be real. And the moment you stop answering questions that were never meant to understand you, you reclaim something essential. Your happiness stops being fragile. It becomes yours.